It is the night of March 9th, 1945. 334 American bombers are approaching Tokyo. They are not carrying the precision bombs used in previous raids. They are carrying something different, something that cannot be put out with water. In the next 3 hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo will burn. Approximately 100,000 people will die in a single night. General Curtis LeMay ordered the raid. History called him a war criminal. Some still do. But here's what those same historians also calculated. That raid and the campaign it started almost certainly saved more lives than it took, including Japanese lives. That is not a comfortable statement. It is not supposed to be, but it is the statement that the evidence demands. My name is Eddie Arsenal. Hit that subscribe button right now if this is your first time here. This channel is where the real stories get told, including the ones that make you uncomfortable. Here is the paradox at the center of this story. The weapon condemned as the most barbaric instrument of the entire Pacific War almost certainly prevented a catastrophe that would have dwarfed everything that came before it. The weapon called an instrument of pure terror was, by the cold calculation of military historians, one of the most life-saving decisions made by any commander in the entire conflict. Today we are talking about napalm, about the firebombing of Japan, about General LeMay, and about the moral calculation that sits at the center of one of the most debated decisions in the history of warfare. But before we talk about what napalm did, we have to talk about why it was used. Because the decision to firebomb Japanese cities was not made from cruelty, it was made from failure. By early 1945, the American precision bombing campaign against Japan had largely collapsed. The B-29 Superfortress, the most expensive weapons program in American history at the time, more expensive than the Manhattan Project, was not delivering the results it had promised. High-altitude precision bombing from 30,000 feet over Japan faced problems that the campaign planners had not fully anticipated. The jet stream, discovered by American bombers over Japan, created winds of over 200 miles per hour at bombing altitude. A bomb aimed at a factory could miss by half a mile. Japanese industry had also adapted. After early bombing raids, Japanese military planners had dispersed industrial production away from large factory complexes, the kind of targets that precision bombing could realistically destroy, and into thousands of small home workshops spread throughout residential neighborhoods. A neighborhood of wooden houses, each one containing a small lathe or a component assembly operation, supplying a chain of production that eventually produced aircraft engines or artillery shells. This was what American bombers were facing. There was no single factory to destroy. The factory was the neighborhood. This was not an accident. Japanese military planners had deliberately embedded war production into civilian areas, specifically because they understood that American precision bombing doctrine required a discrete, identifiable target. Disperse the production into 10,000 small workshops in residential areas, and there's no target for precision bombing to hit. So the precision campaign failed, not because the technology was inadequate, not because the crews were insufficiently skilled, but because the target set had been deliberately engineered to be immune to precision attack. A different approach was required, and the different approach that LeMay chose was the one that history has argued about ever since. Now let's talk about napalm, because understanding what it is and how it works explains both why it was so effective and why it produced the results it did in the specific conditions of Japanese urban areas in 1945. Napalm is not a single substance. It is a concept, a thickening agent mixed with fuel to create a gel that burns longer, hotter, and in a more concentrated area than unthickened fuel. The specific napalm used in the incendiary bombs dropped on Japan in 1945 was a mixture of gasoline with a thickening compound developed at Harvard University in 1942. The M69 incendiary bomb was the primary weapon of LeMay's campaign. It was a small weapon, approximately 6 pounds, that could be packed by the hundreds into a single cluster container. When the container opened at altitude, hundreds of M69s would scatter across a wide area. Each one would ignite on impact, producing a burning gel that clung to whatever surface it hit and could not be extinguished with water. The specific vulnerability of Japanese urban construction to incendiary attack was not a discovery of 1945. It had been studied and documented by American planners for years. Japanese cities were built primarily of wood and paper. The residential density was extraordinary. In some Tokyo neighborhoods, the density exceeded 100,000 people per square mile. The combination of construction material and density created conditions that incendiary weapons were specifically designed to exploit. LeMay's tactical innovation for the March 9th raid went beyond simply switching from conventional to incendiary bombs. He changed the entire attack profile. Instead of high-altitude formation bombing, he sent his B-29s in low, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet at night, without the defensive gun positions that normally added weight and required gunners, each aircraft carrying the maximum possible bomb load. The reasoning was precise. At low altitude at night, Japanese anti-aircraft fire would be less accurate. Japanese night fighters were limited in capability. The lower altitude would improve bombing accuracy, and removing the defensive armament would allow each aircraft to carry significantly more incendiaries, translating directly into more fire on the target. It was also an enormous personal risk for LeMay himself. If the raid failed, if Japanese defenses were more effective than anticipated, if the losses were catastrophic, if the tactical innovation produced disaster rather than results, LeMay would be relieved of command and court-martialed. He made the decision anyway because he believed the conventional approach was failing and something had to change. The raid on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, Operation Meetinghouse, was the most destructive air raid in human history. More destructive in terms of immediate casualties than either atomic bomb. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned. Approximately 100,000 people died. 1 million more were left homeless. The physical destruction was almost incomprehensible in scale. Tokyo's Shitamachi district, a densely populated working-class area that was also the center of the dispersed home workshop war production system, was essentially erased. The firestorm that the incendiaries produced consumed everything within its boundaries, with a completeness that conventional bombing could never approach. LeMay followed the Tokyo raid with additional raids against other Japanese cities in rapid succession. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, all struck within the following week. By the end of the first week of the campaign, Japan had lost more urban and industrial area than in all the previous months of conventional bombing combined. Now let's talk about the Japanese side of this story, because to understand the full moral calculation, you have to understand what Japan was planning and what a land invasion of the Japanese home islands would have actually looked like. By early 1945, Japan's military leadership knew the war was going badly. The island campaigns had demonstrated that American forces would eventually reach the home islands. Naval power was largely destroyed. Air power was being ground down by American fighters and anti-aircraft defenses. But the Japanese military leadership had a plan, and it was a plan that should make anyone who evaluates the firebombing campaign pause before issuing a simple moral verdict. The plan was called Ketsugo, the decisive battle for the defense of the Japanese home islands. It was built on a specific strategic calculation that if Japan could make an American invasion sufficiently costly in American lives, American public opinion would demand a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. The Japanese military was betting that American democracy could not sustain the casualties that Ketsugo was designed to produce. Ketsugo was not a conventional military defense plan. It called for the mobilization of every Japanese citizen as a combatant. The civilian population, men, women, and children above a certain age, were to be organized into militia units and armed with whatever was available: bamboo spears, improvised explosive charges, suicide tactics adapted from the kamikaze concept and applied on land. Japanese military planners estimated they could mobilize approximately 28 million civilian fighters for the defense of the home islands, in addition to the regular military forces that would be concentrated there. American planners studying the same intelligence concluded that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would be unlike anything that had come before in the Pacific War. The American operational plan for the invasion was called Operation Downfall, consisting of 2 phases. Operation Olympic would land on the southern island of Kyushu in November 1945. Operation Coronet would land on Honshu near Tokyo in the spring of 1946. The scale was enormous. The the largest amphibious operation ever planned, dwarfing even the Normandy landings. The casualty estimates produced by American military planners for Operation Downfall are the numbers that make the moral calculation of the firebombing campaign impossible to resolve simply. The estimates varied depending on assumptions, but the range consistently appeared between 250,000 and 1 million American dead, with wounded bringing total American casualties to potentially several times those numbers. Japanese casualty estimates for Operation Downfall were even more staggering. American planners estimated between 5 and 10 million Japanese military and civilian deaths from a land invasion, in addition to the deaths that would result from continued conventional and strategic bombing, continued naval blockade, and the starvation that blockade was already producing. These estimates were not speculation. They were based on the casualty rates from Iwo Jima and Okinawa, scaled to the geography and population of the home islands. The Battle of Okinawa had produced approximately 12,000 American dead and approximately 110,000 Japanese military dead, along with somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilian deaths. Okinawa was one island. Kyushu was an island of 13 million people. Honshu contained the majority of Japan's population of 72 million. Now let's pause here, because the numbers are becoming abstract in the way that large numbers always do, and the story requires that we resist that abstraction. We are talking about human beings, about families, about decisions made by specific men in specific circumstances, with incomplete information about what the consequences of each choice would actually be. General LeMay did not know in March 1945 that the atomic bomb would be ready by August. He did not know that Japan would surrender in September. He made decisions based on what he knew, that the conventional bombing campaign was failing, that the war was continuing, that American and Japanese men were dying every day it continued, and that a land invasion was the alternative to finding a way to end it from the air. The civilians who died in the March 9th raid did not choose to be in Tokyo. They did not choose to live in a city whose residential neighborhoods had been deliberately integrated with war production by a military government they had limited ability to influence or resist. They were victims of the war, of their government's decisions, and of LeMay's bombs. That is true, and it matters. It is also true that the war production those neighborhoods contained was being used to build weapons that were killing American soldiers, that was supporting a military government that had killed millions of people across Asia, and that would have been used to resist an invasion that American planners estimated would kill millions more. That is also true, and it also matters. Holding both of those truths simultaneously, without resolving the tension between them into a comfortable single verdict, is what honest engagement with this history requires. The firebombing of Japan does not have a clean moral answer. Anyone who tells you it does is not being honest with you. Now let's talk about what the firebombing campaign actually achieved, because the strategic results of LeMay's campaign are essential to evaluating it honestly. Between March and August 1945, American B-29s firebombed 67 Japanese cities. The campaign destroyed approximately 40% of the urban area of those cities. It rendered approximately 8 million Japanese civilians homeless. It destroyed the home workshop production network that had made Japanese industry resistant to conventional precision bombing. Japanese industrial production collapsed. Aircraft production, already strained by material shortages and the loss of experienced workers, fell dramatically. Food distribution networks were disrupted. The infrastructure that a modern military needs to sustain operations was being systematically destroyed in a way that conventional bombing had never achieved. The Japanese military's ability to resist an American invasion was deteriorating, not just because of the bombing. The naval blockade that American submarines and surface forces had maintained for years was also strangling Japan's import-dependent economy. But the firebombing campaign accelerated the collapse in ways that the blockade alone could not. By the summer of 1945, Japan was facing a reality that its military leadership acknowledged privately, even as it publicly maintained the position that resistance would continue. Food production was projected to fall to levels that would produce mass starvation by late 1945 or early 1946. Fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The training program for new pilots had been shut down due to fuel shortages, and still, the Japanese military leadership argued for continued resistance. Because Ketsugo remained the plan, because the calculation remained that if an American invasion could be made sufficiently costly, a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender might be achievable. The civilian population suffering, including the deaths from the firebombing, was factored into this calculation as an acceptable cost of achieving the strategic objective. This is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the moral debate around the firebombing of Japan. The Japanese military government that was choosing to continue the war was not unaware of what that choice was, costing Japanese civilians. It was making a deliberate calculation that those costs were acceptable in pursuit of a negotiated settlement. The firebombing did not create Japanese civilian suffering. It added to suffering that the Japanese military leadership had already decided was an acceptable price. Now let's talk about the atomic bombs, because they are inseparable from the firebombing campaign in any honest accounting of what ended the Pacific War and what the alternatives were. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945 killed approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people immediately in each city, with radiation deaths bringing the total to somewhere between 130,000 and 220,000 people across both cities. These numbers are horrifying. They are also smaller than the death toll of the March 9th Tokyo raid alone. What the atomic bombs provided that the firebombing campaign could not was a specific kind of shock, an event so unprecedented that it gave the Japanese Emperor Hirohito the political cover to intervene directly in the surrender decision over the objections of the military leadership that had been driving the war. The emperor's intervention, his direct and unusual decision to break the deadlock among the Japanese leadership, was the critical moment. Without the emperor's intervention, the Japanese military leadership was prepared to continue the war regardless of the firebombing campaign's effects. The military faction had already survived months of devastating losses and was prepared to absorb more. What they could not absorb was a weapon that seemed to render their Ketsugo resistance plan strategically obsolete, because Ketsugo required time, and an atomic bomb could destroy a city before Ketsugo could be implemented. The surrender came on August 15, 1945. The formal signing was September 2, 1945. The land invasion that had been planned for November 1945 never happened. The casualty estimates, American and Japanese, that had driven the planning for Operation Downfall were never tested against reality. And that is where the moral calculation becomes most difficult and most important. The lives saved by avoiding Operation Downfall are invisible. They are lives that were not lost, deaths that did not occur, families that were not destroyed. The lives lost in the firebombing and the atomic bombings are visible, documented, named. The asymmetry between visible deaths and invisible lives saved is one of the most profound moral challenges in evaluating any wartime decision. Military historians who have studied this question, and they have studied it exhaustively, with access to both American and Japanese planning documents that were not available for decades after the war, have generally reached a conclusion that is uncomfortable for anyone looking for a simple answer. The firebombing campaign, combined with the atomic bombs and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, produced a surrender that prevented a catastrophe significantly larger than the catastrophe they caused. That conclusion does not make the firebombing right in any simple moral sense. It does not mean that LeMay was not a war criminal by some definitions of that term. It does not mean that the civilians who died in Tokyo on March 9th deserved to die, or that their deaths were anything other than a tragedy. It means that the world in which the firebombing did not happen was almost certainly a worse world, by a significant margin, than the world in which it did. Now let's talk about LeMay himself, because he is one of the most complex figures in American military history, and his story is essential to understanding how the decisions we have been discussing were actually made. Curtis LeMay was 38 years old when he ordered the March 9th raid. He had built his reputation as the most rigorous and innovative bombing commander in the American Air Forces, a man who flew missions himself to observe results, who relentlessly analyzed after-action data, who was willing to accept casualties to achieve results, but was equally unwilling to accept casualties that produced nothing. LeMay was not a man who enjoyed destruction. He was a man who had concluded, based on extensive analysis of what was and was not working, that the conventional approach was failing, and that failing was costing lives. American lives every day the war continued, and ultimately more Japanese lives than the alternative he was about to employ. His post-war statement that he would have been tried as a war criminal if Japan had won is one of the most honest assessments any military commander has ever made of his own actions. That honesty, acknowledging that the same actions can be judged differently depending on outcome, is actually the beginning of honest moral engagement with this history rather than the end of it. LeMay knew that what he was doing was terrible. He believed it was less terrible than the alternative. History has largely, not unanimously, but largely supported that belief. Now let's talk about the legacy of napalm, because the weapon developed for the firebombing of Japan did not disappear with Japan's surrender. It was used in Korea. It was used in Vietnam. Each subsequent use generated its own moral debate, its own documentation of civilian suffering, its own contested calculation of military necessity versus humanitarian cost. The photograph of Kim Phuc, the 9-year-old Vietnamese girl running from a napalm strike in 1972, is one of the most famous war photographs in history. It became the defining image of American napalm use in Vietnam, and it contributed directly to the international campaign that eventually produced a United Nations convention restricting the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations. That convention, Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, does not ban napalm entirely. It restricts its use against civilians and civilian areas. The distinction it draws is precisely the distinction that the debate around the 1945 firebombing campaign hinges on: the line between military necessity and civilian harm, and who gets to draw it. Now let's bring this story to its conclusion, because the complete arc of the napalm firebombing campaign reveals something important about how we evaluate historical decisions and what honest moral engagement with terrible choices actually requires. The easy verdict is condemnation. The weapon was terrible. The deaths were real. The destruction was on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Condemning the firebombing requires nothing more than acknowledging these facts, which are true. The harder verdict is the one that the evidence actually supports: that the alternative, Operation Downfall, the land invasion of Japan, was projected to produce casualties on a scale that dwarfs the firebombing campaign. That the Japanese military government that chose to continue the war bears moral responsibility for the costs of continuing it. That the men who made the decision to firebomb Japan were not monsters. They were commanders faced with a failing campaign, a continuing war, and an alternative that their analysis told them would be worse. The hardest verdict, the most honest one, is that both of these things are true simultaneously. The firebombing was terrible. It was probably necessary. Both of those statements can be accurate at the same time, and the discomfort of holding them both is not a sign that something has gone wrong in your moral reasoning. It is a sign that something has gone right. By August 1945, the United States Army Air Forces had firebombed 67 Japanese cities, had destroyed 40% of their urban area, had rendered 8 million people homeless, and had collapsed the war-making capacity of a nation that its own military leadership had been prepared to defend to the last civilian. The surrender that followed prevented a land invasion that would almost certainly have killed millions more. General LeMay, called a war criminal, awarded the Medal of Merit by Japan after the war. The Japanese government that replaced the military dictatorship, choosing to recognize his role in ending the conflict that the military dictatorship had chosen to prolong. That contradiction, war criminal and decorated by the nation he bombed, is the contradiction at the heart of this entire story. The napalm bomb, called Barbaric, called an instrument of pure terror, credited by military historians with forcing a surrender that prevented a catastrophe on a scale that would have made the firebombing look minor. Not a comfortable weapon to discuss, not a comfortable calculation to make. Both of those truths belong in the same sentence. Drop a comment telling me, where do you stand on this? Do the projected casualties from Operation Downfall justify what LeMay ordered? Because this is one of the questions that military history has never resolved, and I want to know what you think. And if you want to know about the American weapon that could destroy a target from 30,000 feet with precision that seemed impossible in 1944, the technology that made precision bombing actually work, that story is next. Subscribe to Eddie Arsenal, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next one. Let's load it up.